Hello, my name is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and welcome to the first of the, not really lectures, but sort of mini lectures in our class, Health and Healing in Christian History. It's nice to meet you, sort of meet you anyway, and at another time I will do a webcast that includes not only the images and the bullet points of this little lecture, but also me as well, so you can see me. But today my hair is horrific, and it's kind of a stay-at-home day, so you're just going to have to settle for just the lecture itself and my voice, which whenever I play it back sounds really annoying to me. Anyway, what I want to talk with you about is about sources for the study of Christian history, and also a little bit about attitude towards sources. So, as you probably know from having read through the first bit of text for this class, that there are two sources for the study of Christian history. The most important of the sources for a historian are, of course, primary sources. And primary sources are not just documents that are written by people who participated in the events, but they are very often a first-time account of an event, although, again, not always. Ultimately, a primary source is a document, or it is an object written or created during the time under study. Okay? And I'll say a little bit more about what exactly that looks like. Another type of source that historians need and use, and in fact create, are secondary sources. And secondary sources interpret and analyze a primary source. So when we're thinking about primary sources and secondary sources, we're going to be using both for our class. And a secondary source for our class will be the articles that I post, the chapters that are written about the time under study. But the primary sources are the key documents of our particular class. Now, the question that I have for you are, what are some possible primary sources for the study of religious history? And it's kind of a tricky question, because a primary source is different depending on the discipline. So, for example, if this were a film studies course, and we were spending time studying films that were, let's say, films that were made based on books, okay? So let's say we were studying films based on books like the Harry Potter movies. So the Harry Potter movies would be a primary source, just like the books themselves. If you were taking a course on Harry Potter, those books would be a primary source for the study of popular literature. So in the case of religious history, and especially ancient history, a film is not going to be a primary source. So what are some of the possible primary sources for the study of religious history? Well, there's quite a few different kinds. Sometimes coins can be primary sources for the study of religious history. So, for example, the image on the coin of the imperial figure, we might think, what does that have to do with religion? If we were to look on the back of the coin, we would see that, in fact, there is an image of the emperor here, and the emperor is holding a little tiny person, and this is their lares. And so this is a little divinity that gives us some indication into the character of the imperial figure. So coins can help us in understanding how religious history is constructed in the past. And notice also, and this is kind of an aside comment, notice the emperor has their foot on this person here. And I haven't studied this coin, this particular coin, but I'm willing to bet that individual represents a community that has been conquered by this imperial figure. Just a little fun detail. Other types of primary sources for the study of religious history can include objects that people used, both objects that were used by clearly people with status, people with money, but then also, like these little lamps over here, objects that were used by people in their everyday existence. So if you'll notice right here on this center ampulla or lamp, where'd my cursor go? Okay, you'll notice this little star imagery here. And it's not just decoration, it gives us some insight into the particular religious beliefs of the household that used this particular this is a little lamp. You can see actually that this has been used by the marks left by the flame. And other types of sources for religious history include edifices or architecture. Architecture can tell us something about the belief system of people who constructed it. Other types of sources for religious history include documents. Now, in this case, we have a document, a medieval manuscript that clearly is one of the gospel accounts. And not only the text tells us something about the people who valued this particular document, but the artwork does as well. So if you notice, this is a heavily illustrated document. There's only what looks like 2 lines of text, maybe 3 lines. Let's see, so 1, 2, 3, 4, it looks like 5 sentences on this particular page, and you can imagine the amount of time that went into the creation of this document. So what we can learn by accessing these documents is not just the text that was central to the community, but also the work that went into the production of this text tells us something about what the people thought of the particular text, that it was valuable enough that it needed to be this articulate. It also tells us something about the people who paid for it, that this was seen as a text that needed to be heavily illustrated and had to be appreciated in this way. And notice here, look, there's these little mythological figures here. Notice here's a centaur firing an arrow. It's like a pretty sad scene here. We've got a beautiful bird here, but then here's another bird being killed. So there's all kinds of details about the community that valued this text in this particular primary source. So objects of everyday life, coins, structures, text, these are all things, and art, these are all things that can operate as, these are all primary sources that can teach us something about the past. Closer to our own time period, something like a journal is also going to be a primary source for the study of history. In this case here, we have the very famous Diary of Anne Frank. And of course, for people who are interested in the study of World War II, or in the Holocaust, or in the effects of confinement on people, this is a perfect example of a type of primary source that would be appropriate to that kind of study. So when you're reading primary sources, there are a few things that you can do to have them make sense for you. Common complaints about reading primary sources is that the language is antiquated, or that people talk fancy, or that the translations are poor and obscure the meaning. But there are some things that you can do that can make a primary source make more sense to you. One of the first things that you can do is to use what you know to place the readings in context. And here you have to kind of play a little bit, and you can use your imagination, which is a good thing when you're studying the past. I never advise people to turn to Hollywood for any kind of insight into the past, but if you are a fan of certain types of films or shows that give us some kind of indication of what the past was like, that can give you a visual within your brain to help you understand something of the past. And that's fine. If you need to place the cast of characters in your primary source in your mind on the backdrop of a Ridley Scott movie, like maybe Gladiator or something, then that's a good thing. And that can give you insight into the text. A second thing that is useful in reading primary sources is to make sure that you commit key dates, names, and terms to memory. And a lot of times people don't like to do this, and it's very popular among historians to say, oh, dates don't matter, and terms don't matter, and these are all just petty details. And, you know, to a certain degree they are, but to a certain degree they're certainly not. It's important to know when things happened. It's not the case that we have perfect knowledge about exactly when things happened, but there are just some dates that matter, if nothing else, to be able to hang what you know on a trajectory of time. This can be a very useful thing for understanding the source. If you understand that the source that you're reading was written 500 years before the first century, that's going to change how you approach it. And that approach is going to be different from reading, say, something that was written 3 years ago. So these are important things to consider. The third thing is, of course, to mark the text. Now, this is almost something you can't do in an online course, but if you were sitting with the document in front of you, my advice would be always read with a pencil or a highlighter in hand, and a cup of coffee or a messy drink. The more you actually mark up your document, the more likely you are to remember certain aspects of it. We know that our brain works that way, that if you make some kind of indication on the text, underlining or check marks or question marks, these are the kinds of things that your brain will remember to help you access them better. So the degree to which you can do this with an online text too, I would encourage you to do that as well. A fourth little tip that I have for you is that you pay attention to the genre. Now, by genre, that's a term that means, this kind of connects to here, where I'm saying commit key dates, names, and terms to memory. A term you should know is genre, which means basically the type of document or the category of document that you're reading. So, for example, if you were looking at a receipt for the purchase of a donkey, that's a very different document than if you're looking at a funerary inscription or if you are reading a letter. Okay, so you're not going to ask a letter to do the same thing that a receipt for a transaction is doing, and you're not going to ask a receipt that is evidence of an economic transaction to do the same thing as a letter. So it's important to recognize the type of document that you are reading and not ask one type of document to provide you with information that it is not equipped to provide. A fifth thing you can do is to practice summarizing. And the reason that I encourage this is because it's very important to be able to articulate in a terse or pithy way the main points of something. Now, we're not in a class together, but nevertheless, sometimes I might ask you to do this in your written work. I might ask you to summarize something. And a summary is not you telling the story or all of the details, but a summary is giving a basic, truncated or shortened explanation of what something is and what's happening. And so practicing summary is a very useful tip. And then finally, it's important that you be mindful of prejudices, biases, or assumptions that one finds in primary sources, because this is one of the advantages of reading a primary source, is that we think we're uncovering the actual truth of something, but what we're uncovering is the truth of something through someone's bias, and you are reading it through your bias. And so that's a really important thing of which you must be mindful. We all have biases, we all have prejudices, and we all have assumptions about ideas and people and things. And so it's important before you go condemning someone for their bias, their prejudice, or their assumption, it's important that before you do that, that you recognize that you have them as well. And be mindful of how your prejudices, biases, or assumptions shape your reading of particular texts. Now, when we're reading these primary texts, some of the things that we need to consider in our study of religious history is the nature of historical writing. The types of questions that we want to ask when we're reading historical documents are things like, is the author reliable? Do I trust them? And so knowing who they are is helpful. What's their intention, right? Because their reliability is going to play into the answer to this question. The historical audience is important. To whom is the author writing? And what form does the writing take? And there's that question of genre again. Is the author writing a receipt? Is the author writing a letter? Is the author writing a law? Okay, because the nature of historical writing is going to impact how we interpret what we're reading. And then another important question about historical writing is, was this text that we're reading, was it edited or was it redacted? Meaning, was it altered or changed somewhat? And I'm not talking about translation here. I'm talking about the actual changing of a document. For example, we have from the 3rd century a document that was written by a woman named Perpetua, and the document is selections from her journal that she wrote while she was in prison awaiting her execution. Now, what's interesting about this document is it's one of few that we have from the past that we know was written by a woman. But the answer to the question, what does this text teach us about a woman's experience in the 3rd century, is not one that we can clearly answer, because we know that the text was edited by a man. And so that has to impact how we understand a woman's experience in late antiquity. A second thing we'll consider in our study of religious history is the nature of historical knowledge. So the kinds of questions that we have to ask about that is, what can and what cannot be known from a particular primary source? How do we know what we know about the past, and how can we interpret it? And then finally, can we trust it? And the last piece I would point out here is that there are tools employed in the study of Christian and religious history of which we will learn something. There are databases, there are secondary sources, maps, and general research sources that we will consider and that we will use. And then, of course, there are methods and theoretical approaches to the study of religious history, and in our case, Christian history, that we will need to consider. Now, the last thing I would like to address in this little intro lecture is the types of professional generosities that we need to consider that will shape our history. And these are things that I try to also do in my study of the past. The first is that we will seek to understand people, ideas, practices, events, and institutions on their terms, not on our terms. One of the kind of nice things about the past is that it's over, but that also makes it challenging. And so this, in a way, moves back to that issue of biases and assumptions and prejudices. We have to be mindful that we're intruding on their world when we go back in history and look at people's documents. They're not intruding on ours. And so we need to be respectful and mindful of their social context, which is not our social context. And so consequently, we will not attempt to impose our assumptions about life or our assumptions about religion on another group living in a different time and in a different place. Some of the types of assumptions that sometimes get in the way of study of the past is that the belief that people were dumb, unlike now, right? That people practicing medicine or thinking certain things about the world or the cosmos is because they were dumb and they didn't have access to the tools of our world, which would give people enlightenment. And that's a kind of backward way of thinking on our part. Another assumption is that religious people are anti-intellectual or that they're backward or superstitious. And this is, a problematic view that can really get in the way of an academic study of people's philosophies or religious ideas. Another one of the generosities that will shape our study is that we will be more interested in how an experience of the divine made a difference for a person or a group, rather than whether or not it happened. We do not need to be concerned with whether something actually happened or not. That's not actually the job of a historian. Rather, our job is to look at texts about things that are often labeled as miraculous, and we are to look at those texts with a different set of questions. Primarily, how does this text shape how people behave, rather than did this actually happen or not? That's the task of another group of people other than necessarily historians. So we don't need to worry about things, whether things actually happened or whether they're actually true. Who cares at the end of the day? What's more interesting is what people do with these kinds of experiences and what they do with texts that talk about divine experiences. And then finally, the last professional generosity that I would encourage is that we will recognize that religion is connected to, it is shaped by, and it influences economic, intellectual, medical, political, and social contexts in which it emerges and endures. In other words, religion cannot be separated from all of these factors. We'd like to claim that we live in an environment in which there is a separation of church and state. And I have to be clear that that's not actually language that is used in the First Amendment. So our attitude towards the First Amendment aside, we have to recognize that prior to the construction of that document, there was a clear acceptance of the important relationship between religion and all of these factors, that religion was not seen as standing in conflict with medicine. Religion was not seen as standing in conflict with intellectual culture, with science, or with politics. Now, there are, of course, problems with the relationship between religion and politics, which is why reform movements are important. But if for our particular time period under study, which is the early and medieval centuries of Christianity, we have to recognize that religion is deeply woven into the fabric of life. So, at this point, if you have any questions about any of what I have just talked about, you are, of course, welcome to email me at isonbl@plu.edu. Thank you very much.